Today's question: why is free float the secret to saving your project schedule? By the end, you'll be able to distinguish between free float and total slack to absorb task delays without causing a chain reaction of schedule bottlenecks. PM Panda. PMP, 25 years in the trenches. I've seen teams celebrate being on schedule while the bank account bled out. I've watched good managers crash projects because they tracked the wrong number, assuming that as long as the finish line didn't move, everything was fine. Trust me, the mistake I'm about to show you is how budgets really die, and it usually starts with a simple misunderstanding of flexibility. Picture this: you are managing a major global product launch, and your primary hardware vendor calls to say a critical component is arriving 4 days late. You glance at your master schedule and see the final launch date is still months away, so you shrug it off, tell them it is fine, and get back to your coffee. But 72 hours later, your software testing lead is at your desk, looking like they want to throw a monitor at you because 5 senior engineers are sitting idle with no hardware to test. Your budget starts hemorrhaging cash because you are paying for top-tier talent to browse the internet while they wait for a delivery you thought didn't matter. You fell into the classic trap of assuming that because the project deadline was safe, the immediate next steps were also safe. You confuse the flexibility of the entire project with the flexibility of a specific task, and now you have a resource bottleneck that is entirely your fault. To understand how to fix this, we first need to look at the project network, which is the industry standard tool for planning and monitoring how work actually gets done. This isn't just a list of tasks or a pretty bar chart. It is a logical map built using the inputs from your work breakdown structure to show exactly how task A flows into task B. We call this a network because every activity is an interconnected node that relies on its predecessors to finish before it can begin. If you are not using a network diagram, you aren't really scheduling. You are just wishing on a calendar. The network reveals the hidden dependencies that make or break your timeline, showing you where the traffic jams are going to happen before they actually occur. It is the fundamental dashboard for any manager who wants to stop reacting to crises and start preventing them by seeing the project as a living system. Once we have our map, we perform the mathematical heavy lifting known as the forward and backward passes. The forward pass moves through the project from start to finish to find the earliest possible start and finish dates for every single activity on the board. Then we work backward from our required completion date to calculate the latest possible times a task can start or finish without blowing the deadline. This process is how we discover the mathematical reality of our schedule, stripping away the optimism of the team and replacing it with hard dates. If your early finish and late finish don't match, you have found the breathing room in your schedule. These calculations are the bread and butter of professional certification exams. But in the real world, they are the difference between knowing you are in trouble today versus finding out 3 months too late when the bank account is empty. The first metric we derive from our network pass is total slack, which some people call total float, and it is the number most managers fixate on to their own detriment. Total slack is simply the amount of time an activity can be delayed without affecting the final project completion date or some other hard deadline set by your client. You calculate it by taking the late start and subtracting the early start, or doing the same with the late finish and early finish. If the result is 10 days, you have 10 days of wiggle room before the project end date starts to move. This is a vital number for your status reports and for keeping the stakeholders calm, but it is also a dangerous number if you use it in isolation. It tells you about the project's health, but it tells you absolutely nothing about the health of your individual team members' daily workflows. The reason total slack is so deceptive is that it is often a shared resource across an entire path of tasks, not a private gift for one activity. If you have 10 days of total slack on a path of 5 tasks, and the first task takes all 10 days, the remaining 4 tasks now have 0 slack left. They have been forced onto an artificial critical path because someone up the chain was greedy with the buffer. I have seen countless managers tell a vendor they have 2 weeks of slack only to realize later that they just effectively signed a death warrant for the next 3 departments down the line. Total slack is the project's emergency fund, and if you let one person spend it all in the first month, you will be bankrupt when a real crisis hits later in the year. This is where free slack or free float comes into play to save your reputation and your sanity. Free float is the amount of time an activity can be delayed without delaying the start of the very next task in the sequence. While total slack is about protecting the big picture, free float is about protecting your colleagues and your immediate resources. In that tech launch example, the hardware delivery might have had 30 days of total slack relative to the final launch, but it had zero free float relative to the software testing team. Because the manager ignored the free float, they idled a whole team and blew the budget on labor costs. Free float is the metric that tells you if you are about to create a downstream bottleneck. It is the ultimate reality check that keeps the day-to-day workflow smooth even when the project-level timeline has plenty of room to breathe. You cannot master float without respecting the critical path, which is the longest sequence of tasks through your project network with the least amount of flexibility. Activities on this path are the ones with zero total slack and zero free float, meaning they have absolutely no margin for error. If a critical path task is 1 hour late, your entire project finishes 1 hour late. In any international construction project, this path is the narrow bridge you have to walk perfectly to get to the finish line. However, the biggest mistake I see is managers who develop tunnel vision and only watch the critical path while ignoring everything else. Tasks that currently have float are not guaranteed to stay that way, and if you ignore them, they will eventually turn into a second or third critical path that you didn't plan for and can't manage. Let's walk through a concrete scenario involving the construction of a new international commercial logistics hub to see how this works with actual numbers. We have activity A, which is pouring the concrete foundation, and it is on our critical path with exactly 0 days of slack. Then we have activity B, which is ordering and receiving the interior light fixtures for the warehouse. According to our network calculations, activity B has 10 days of total slack, meaning we could technically wait quite a while before the lights arrive without delaying the final handover of the building. However, our schedule also shows that activity B has only 2 days of free float because it is followed immediately by activity C, which is the specialized electrical installation crew. This crew is scheduled to start the moment the lights arrive, and they are a high-cost resource that we have booked for a specific window of time. Now, imagine our lighting vendor hits a logistical snag and delivers those fixtures 4 days late. Because we had 10 days of total slack, the final project completion date is still safe and the stakeholders are none the wiser. But here is the problem. Because we only had 2 days of free float, that 4-day delay has now pushed the start of the electrical installation crew back by 2 full days. In my experience, this is exactly where the money starts to disappear. You now have a specialized crew sitting idle on your site for 2 days because the materials aren't there, and you are paying their day rate while they wait. Even though the overall project is technically on time, your budget is taking a hit and your resource management is in shambles. If the manager had focused on the free float of 2 days instead of the total slack of 10, they would have known to expedite that delivery. Here is what most people get wrong after I have spent 25 years watching this nonsense. They treat total slack like a gift card that belongs to just one person. Many project managers will tell a subcontractor that they have a week of slack to work with, but they don't realize that if that contractor uses that week, they have just consumed the flexibility for every single task that follows them. In professional certification exams, they love to test you on this because it is a fundamental logic error. Total slack is often a shared pool for an entire path of activities. If the first team uses all the slack, every subsequent team is now on a new artificial critical path with zero room for error. You should never give away your project-level buffer to one vendor unless you want to spend the rest of your life managing a high-stress crisis. The second biggest mistake is what I call the trap of the silent task, those activities that aren't on the critical path so nobody ever checks on them during the weekly status meetings. Teams focus entirely on the zero slack tasks while the tasks with free float are allowed to drift into dangerous territory. As free float gets eaten up by small, unmonitored delays, the project schedule becomes increasingly brittle and loses its ability to absorb shocks. Before you know it, a task that was once safe has no free float left, meaning it starts pushing its successor, which pushes the next successor, and suddenly your resource plan is a mess. I have seen countless projects where the critical path stayed green while the rest of the schedule turned deep red because the manager wasn't watching the free float as an early warning system for resource bottlenecks. For those of you preparing for professional certification exams, pay close attention to the math because it is the easiest way to lose points if you are rushing through the questions. Remember that total slack is calculated using the difference between early and late dates for the same activity, but free float is calculated by looking at the gap between an activity's early finish and the early start of its successor. This distinction is more than just a formula. It is a logic check on how much you understand about dependency. If a question asks you how to find the critical path, you look for zero total slack. But if a question asks how a delay will impact the immediate next step, you must look at free float. Mastering these calculations isn't just about passing a test. It is about proving you can manage the flow of work in a real environment. To wrap this all up, always keep in mind that total slack protects your final project end date from moving, while free float protects the start date of the very next task on your list. Understanding both is the only way to prevent cascading delays that leave your team idle and your project budget bleeding out from resource bottlenecks. If you manage the free float, the total slack usually takes care of itself. Your actionable next step for today is to go open your project network diagram, find one delayed task that isn't on the critical path, and check if its delay exceeds its free float. If it does, stop what you are doing and talk to the next person in line before the bottleneck gets worse. If this breakdown helped you save your schedule, hit like so I know to keep making these, and subscribe if you want practitioner lessons every week.